All right, everybody, welcome back. We are going to dive into the forearm, wrist, hand, and fingers this week. So we're moving from chapter 23 into chapter 24. I hope you guys have already read it or you're going to read it right after this. Remember, you can skip through the injuries and eval and special tests and all that stuff. We really just want to know the anatomy and we want to know the rehab, the therapeutic exercises that you can do. Okay. Couple updates before we get started. Remember, we have our rehab project coming up. I hope you guys are thinking about that, what injury you want to do. Remember, you can do anything from the upper extremity, lower extremity, whatever you want, but you need to do a little bit of research to figure out what the injury is and what tissues affected and how it happens and stuff like that. But then you're going to use what we've learned in here to talk about the tissue healing phases for that injury, the rehab phases for that injury, what therapeutic exercises you would use, what therapeutic modalities you would use, and then how you would, determine their return to play or clearing them to play, stuff like that. Okay, so if you have any questions on that, feel free to message me, but be thinking of what injury you're going to do. At the end of next week, I'm going to have a spot for you guys to post what injury you're doing. That way, one, we don't have multiple people doing the same injury, but two, I know that you're getting started on it and thinking about what you're going to do. Okay, and then remember, as we go through these lectures, when we get to the body part where your injury is, that's free, info for you to help you with, exercises you can do, and helping you with the anatomy and stuff like that. So just be thinking of those. Okay. All right. Another update at the end of next week, we're going to have a quiz. It'll be on all the upper extremity stuff. So it'll be elbow, forearm, wrist, hand, fingers, and shoulder. We're going to do shoulder next week. Okay. So we'll have a quiz at the end of next week. Well, let's get started. A little bit of overview first. We have the anatomy of the forearm. Okay. Last week we pretty much just talked about the forearm up here by the elbow. All right, but now we want to move our way down the forearm. Okay. Remember, outside of the arm is the radius, inside of the arm is the ulna. Okay, so if you're holding your hands out to the side, palms facing forward, the bone on the outside would be your radius, the bone on the inside would be your ulna. Okay, so this is the radial shaft of the bone, and this is the ulnar shaft of the bone. Okay, and then as we get down towards the wrist, this is where our hand is right in here, and this is really where the wrist joint is. Okay, and so the forearm connects to the wrist with the radius and the ulna. And there's two little bony prominences I want you to know about, and those are called the styloid process. Okay, and we have a radial styloid process, and we have an ulnar styloid process. Okay, and if you're feeling on your own wrist, you can feel that bony prominence on the outside of your wrist, and that's your ulnar styloid process. Okay, and you also have one on the inside. It's a little bit harder to feel. It's not quite as prominent, but that's the radial styloid process. Okay. So here we go. We got ulnar styloid process, radial styloid process. On the back side over here, ulnar styloid process, radial styloid process. Okay. So that's really all you need to know as we work our way down the forearm towards the wrist. Radial shaft, ulnar shaft, and the two styloid processes. Okay. Remember last week we talked about the pronator and supinator muscles. Okay, pronator muscle turns your hand over like you're pouring a bowl of soup out. Okay, the supinator muscle opens that hand back up like you're holding a bowl of soup. Okay, so this would be supination. This would be pronation right here. And remember, the pronator muscle is on the inside of the elbow right here, inside of the forearm. It attaches to the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Okay, so that's the pronator muscle. And really located in that same area is our wrist flexor mass, our wrist flexor muscles. Okay, we don't need to know all these separate individual wrist flexors and hand flexors, but we want to know that the flexor group is located right in here. Okay, along with that pronator muscle. Over here, we have, remember, the supinator muscle on the outside of the elbow right here. And along with that supinator muscle is all of the extensor muscles. So that's like the extensor muscle group right there. Okay. So again and again, we have a bunch of extensor muscles. We don't need to know them all individually. We need to know that that wrist extensor group is right there. And that's also where that supinator muscle is. Okay. So that's it for forearm review. Now we'll get into the wrist, hand, and fingers. Okay, and this is a model of a left hand. So if you were to hold your left hand up, your thumb is on the inside, pointed towards your midline. Okay, so you're looking at the back of your left hand. Okay, then we can kind of follow where all these bones are. Okay, so starting at the wrist down here, these are all called your carpal bones. Okay, and that's really your true wrist is the carpal bones. Okay, so the ulna comes up right here and attaches. The radius comes up right here and attaches. And then these are all the 8 carpal bones. There's 8 different carpal bones. Okay, and if you're looking at the back of your left hand, we can start on the thumb side right here. That is your scaphoid. Okay, so we start with the scaphoid and we move outward. So we'll go scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform. We would come back to the thumb side, trapezium, trapezoid, working our way out, capitate, and hamate. Okay, the hamate has this little hook on it. It's still part of the hamate, but it's called the hook of the hamate. Okay, and the way that you can remember that, the little mnemonic that they use is some lovers try positions that they can't handle. Okay, some lovers try position, scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, that they can't handle, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. All right, so those are the carpal bones right there. Now, the next segment is called our metacarpals. So carpals, carpal bones, and then our metacarpal bones. Okay, and the metacarpals are basically our hand. So everything between our wrist and our fingers, our hand portion, that's the metacarpals. Okay, and if we start with the thumb, we have metacarpal 1. Okay, so we just number them, which makes it easy to remember. Okay, so we have metacarpal 1, we have metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, and metacarpal 5. Okay, so when you refer to injury to any of those, you would just say, oh, I injured my 5th metacarpal, I injured my 1st metacarpal. Okay, that would be how you would refer to it anatomically. Okay, then after the metacarpals, we have the phalanges. Okay, and all of these finger bones are called phalanges. Okay, and we can refer to this whole phalangeal segment as the first phalange, second phalange, third phalange, fourth phalange, and fifth phalange. Okay, but remember, we want to be able to identify specifically what part of the bone is hurt. Okay, so if we're looking at the first phalange, there's 2 segments. Okay, so we're going to call it the proximal phalanx and the distal phalanx. Okay, that's how we're going to identify that they're 2 different segments. Okay, the rest of the phalanges have 3 segments. Okay, so we have a proximal phalange, middle phalange, and distal phalange. Okay, so the thumb, the first phalange only has a proximal and a distal. The rest of them have a proximal, middle, and distal. Proximal, middle, distal. Okay, so if we wanted to refer to an injury, say this bone segment right here, we would say this is the middle phalanx on the 4th phalange, or the 4th middle phalange. Okay, that's how we would identify it. Okay, if we wanted to identify, this is our pointer finger. If we wanted to identify this bone right here, that would be the second proximal phalange. Okay, so that's how we would identify specifically what we're talking about. Okay, then the other thing we want to know is that each of these segments, all of the metacarpals and the phalangeal bones, they all have a base, body, and head. Okay, the base is closest to you, okay, closest to your body, and then there's a body of it, and then there's a head that is farthest away from you. Okay, so the phalanges have it, a base, body, and head, and so do the metacarpals, a base, body, and head. So that helps you to be even more specific with how you're identifying the joint, or the bone, sorry. Okay, and then in between each of these bones is all these joints, and it might sound confusing, but it's actually really easy the way that we refer to them. Okay, so we just refer to the proximal bone first and then the distal bone. Okay, so this joint right here would be the metacarpal phalangeal joint. And all of these actually would be metacarpal phalangeal joints. And if we wanted to say specifically which one, the first metacarpal phalangeal joint, the second metacarpal phalangeal joint, and so on. And then when we refer to these ones, we can just say interphalangeal joint. Okay, we can say the proximal interphalangeal joint, the distal interphalangeal joint, and obviously the first phalange only has one interphalangeal joint. Okay, so it kind of sounds confusing, but if you think about it, it's just common sense. You just refer to the bones on either side of it, and you've got it. Okay, that's why I like down here, this is called the radiocarpal joint, because the radius is right here, and then these are the carpal bones, radiocarpal. If you want to refer to these joints, you would say the carpal metacarpal joints. So, hope that makes sense. Moving forward a little bit, here's some tendons and stuff on the finger. The only thing I really want you to know here is all the flexor tendons that would curl your fingers up into a fist. All the flexor tendons are on the bottom here. Okay, so we have a couple different ones you can see, but they're all the wrist flexors are on the bottom here. Okay, and then all the wrist extensors are on the top, and those are the ones that would open your hand back out. Okay, so wrist extensors come across the top, the wrist flexors come across the bottom. Alright, and I just like this image because it shows, we talked about the wrist flexor group being on the inside of your elbow, and it shows all these wrist flexor tendons that come down into your wrist and hand and fingers. All those wrist flexors are on the palm side of your hand. Okay, so if you're holding your hand up, palm facing towards you, these are all the wrist flexor tendons going through here. Okay, and then on this other image, if you look at the back of your hand, that's where all the wrist extensor tendons come through. Okay, so they come from that big muscle group up by your elbow, and they come through your hand. Some of them attach in your hand, some of them attach in your fingers, but these are all the wrist extensors on the back of your hand and wrist. Okay. Last thing for this little PowerPoint, I just wanted to show this because this kind of helps you think of where they are when you're looking at your actual hand. Okay, so instead of at a bony, muscly looking hand like that other slide. Okay, so here's all those wrist flexors again coming through here. On this side, these are all those wrist extensors on the back of your hand. Okay, and then here's those bones that we were just looking at, but it's easier to see when you're looking at a real hand instead of a bony hand. Okay, so that's it for this one. We'll get the exercises on the next PowerPoint.